Good morning. It is Monday, April the 22nd, and this is The Drill. And thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only one of two true conservatives in the United States of America today, because we make the presumption for the status quo, and the other true conservative, it would be President Trump. So the question for the day is Glenn Beck conservative? Glenn Beck is a nationally syndicated radio talk show host. He also has a television show, and he also has a network known as The Blaze. And the short answer is no, he is not a conservative. But he's a little bit different than, say, Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh, who are reactionary. Glenn Beck has a tendency to be idealistic. He falls basically into the same camp as socialists. And the reason that I'm saying that is because he does not make the presumption for the status quo. He makes the presumption for change. His attitude and the socialists are similar in that both of them look at this country. They get up in the morning, look at this country, and say, tisk, 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 shake their head. What a sorry state of affairs. We need to get to work and roll up our sleeves and reform the country. The socialists want to reform the country in order to produce a socialist paradise, and Glenn Beck wants to reform the country to create conservative paradise. But both of them are looking for an ideal. That puts them basically both in the same camp, although they're two sides of the same coin, is the way Ayn Rand put it. Like I said, there's a lot of people on the right that are idealistic and are, again, not simply just looking to be a bulwark against socialism, not simply reactionary, but are actually looking for an ideal state. In part, I think the reason that they do this is because there's a saying that the best defense is a good offense. And there's another saying that fight fire with fire. And I think that with Glenn Beck and others, it is a combination of those two things, where they decided that since the left is creating this movement and they see that this movement is gaining traction around the country, and that there's a lot of changes taking place that Glenn Beck and others find unpleasant, that the best way to deal with this socialist movement is by creating a counter movement, creating a conservative movement. But it's wrong. I used to think that way too. I used to think, hey, that's the best way to stop people. If we're going to go out and try to create a conservative movement, then that will go a long ways towards putting the left on defense. They will have to be defensive, and as long as they're on defense, they're not going to be able to promote their movement, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with this is that it is Hegelian, in that what you're doing is, and Marxism is basically Hegelian, meaning from George Hegel, who is a German philosopher, and he came up with this, the wrong-headed idea that life is about historical forces clashing together, and that there is a thesis, an antithesis, they clash together, they produce a synthesis. And from that synthesis, there's, again, another thesis, you find an antithesis, clash them together, and they create a new synthesis. And that's the way history progresses. Not so, because history is basically just what happened yesterday, 5 minutes ago, 10 years ago, etc. So history, because the left keeps talking about being on the wrong side of history, as though history is some sort of a living thing or a dynamic, and it is no such thing. And also as though history is sort of like a way of telling the future. They also believe that there are certain things that are inevitable, that are fated, if you will, they're somewhat fatalistic about things. Marx is the one that predicted that there will be a socialist paradise, that there's no doubt about that. The only question is when and exactly how that's going to come about. So people think that I'm going to create a counter movement that's going to put the left on defensive, and that will put us, go a long ways towards creating that bulwark against socialism. But again, it doesn't work. All you're going to end up doing is compromising, because that's what this basically thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing is. Compromise. That's what the left is talking about when they're always talking about compromise. When you hear them on C-SPAN, the Democrats talking about we need to compromise. We were sent up here to compromise. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about creating a synthesis. The right wants one thing, the left wants something else. We'll clash them together and we'll come up with some kind of a synthesis. And you can look at Roe v. Wade as perhaps the prototype or the archetypal synthesis of right and wrong. Because, and Ayn Rand had suggested this, had said in the compromise between right and wrong, who wins? In the compromise between good and evil, who wins? That's obvious. So you look at Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade was a compromise. Roe v. Wade was a compromise. Roe v. Wade did not legalize abortion. A lot of people like to say that, but it's not true. What Roe v. Wade did is said, okay, we'll have abortion, but only under certain circumstances. Only up to 20 weeks gestation. After 20 weeks, no go. State has a compelling interest after that. Before that, then it's between a woman and her doctor. So it was kind of a waffly kind of a situation. But again, it was a compromise. And there is no compromise, there is no middle ground, there is no moderacy when it comes to abortion. Either conception begins, or either life begins at conception or it doesn't. Just that simple. And if life begins at conception, then it doesn't matter what the gestation that they want to talk about. And the reason, by the way, they picked 20 weeks was, and this is done not by scientists, not by doctors, but this was done by a Supreme Court justice who came up with this 20-week standard. But the reason it was what they call viability outside the womb. That's how they said life doesn't start until the fetus is viable outside the womb. And so the arbitrary mark for that was 20 weeks gestation. So it's a compromise. The fact of the matter is that it is a living entity at the moment of conception. It's cells, and they're growing and dividing, etc. And so it's either, again, one or the other. You can't there's no middle ground here for abortion. It's an either-or proposition. And so what they end up doing is nobody ends up happy. They create a political decision out of a medical or biological issue or problem. So so that's the compromise, and that's what a lot of the people on the right are thinking, and the left at the same time. Some of the people on the right are thinking, well, we can't stop socialists, but we might be able to slow them down and or moderate the results. If we hit them with conservatism, we become conservative activists and clash our ideas with theirs, then we'll come out with something we're not exactly thrilled with, but it won't be socialism either. Neither one of us will be happy. The same kind of thing with abortion. Nobody's really happy with abortion, the Roe v. Wade, I mean, and that's the way it is with the idea of compromising. Nobody's terribly happy with it, but people think this is what we have to do. And it's wrong. What you have to do is go into the situation, make the presumption for the status quo, be open-minded. I'm willing to admit that there may be a case for change in any given situation. I am willing to listen. But what I'm not willing to do is I'm not willing to be psychologically bullied or intimidated. I'm not willing to be psychologically manipulated. I am willing to be persuaded. If somebody left, right, or center wants to go ahead and persuade me that change is necessary and that their prescription for change is what's best, I'm willing to listen, and I'm willing to admit that they're right, and I am willing to get behind the idea. The classic case is with Miss Cortez and her Green New Deal. The problem with the New Deal is that there's a whole bunch of questions that have to be answered before I can get on board. I'm willing to get on board as long as she can answer the questions. One of the biggest questions is, why 12 years? Where do you get the idea that the planet is going to be dead in 12 years? The next question is are all these sacrifices that are going to have to be made, are they going to apply to everybody or only to people that are not in Congress? We've seen it too many times where congressional people write themselves exemptions, such as in the case of the Affordable Health Care Act, or is it Affordable Care Act? I think it's for Affordable Health Care Act, but popularly known as Obamacare. And the staffs, the politicians went to Mr. Obama and said, wait, the Congress people, he said, it's not for me, but my staff is complaining about having to be on Obamacare, and so we want an exemption. So President Obama wrote them an exemption. And they very often do this. And what they end up doing is that we no longer have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, but of the elites, by the elites, for the elites. So that you're creating a special group of super citizens that don't have to follow the same laws everybody else does. So that's another question. There's a whole host of questions for the Green New Deal that have to be answered before I'm willing to get on board. Okay, I'm being reasonable, I'm being rational, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it and just come out and say, well, it's not going to work because I'm a conservative and I hate liberalism or I hate socialism and Ms. Cortez is a socialist. Okay, just because Ms. Cortez is a socialist doesn't mean she can't have and will not have automatically good ideas. So I'm willing to listen, but again, I have to be persuaded. If she's going to fearmonger, she's going to tell me that we're all going to be dead in 12 years and you don't produce any proof, it becomes an arbitrary statement, then I'm simply going to ignore her and continue with my life as I always have. And if it comes up to any issues in terms of votes or advising my representatives to vote, the way it stands now, I vote no on the Green New Deal, because there's just too many questions that haven't been answered, and it doesn't look at this particular point like they'll ever be answered. That's the approach that one takes, not trying to come out and create the conservative answer to global warming, for instance. Well, yes, we recognize global warming, but we say that you should seed the oceans with iron, or that was one libertarian idea was that they were thinking about was you get iron or rust or something, and it's somehow supposed to act as some kind of a magnet and take CO2 out of the air, but you put it in the oceans. But various kinds of ideas like that, where again, what you're doing is you're acknowledging something that, first of all, hasn't been established. The only thing that the left, which is global warming, and the left says that there's a consensus. Well, so what? And by the way, where is that consensus? I've never seen the list of names of scientists that are in agreement with global warming. I've never seen it. They claim that it exists, that all the scientists are in agreement. Well, okay, who are they? And what kind of scientists are we talking about? Physicists? Are we talking about people with PhDs in English, economics, political science? Or are we talking about people with climatology, meteorology degrees? No answer. No answer. And until I get answers to that, then the only thing I know about climate change and global warming is that carbon dioxide is not and cannot be a greenhouse gas because it travels along the ground. It's 1.5 times heavier than oxygen. And the greenhouse effect takes place 18 miles high in the sky, in what's known as the troposphere. So, again, with Glenn Beck, no, he's not a conservative. He is idealistic. And this is part of the problem with why we end up with so many socialistic kinds of laws and ideas, is because of this ridiculous notion, this ridiculous Hegelian notion of having to clash ideas, of trying to create a counter movement to counter the socialists, which is basically what they're looking for anyhow. So the other thing I wanted to discuss was on Glenn Beck. I was listening this morning. He was talking about an article in the I think the Huffington Post, excuse me. It was the Huffington Post. It was about Satan. And it said, Satan has a moment. And that the article, at least as much of it as that he read and commented on, was neutral on Satan. Now, Glenn Beck went on and on and on about it, describing the article and mocking it to a certain degree. But again, what he should have been doing was going ahead and, first of all, come out and say it's wrong. That there's no way to be neutral on evil. You're either pro or you're anti-evil. Okay, and that's what Satan represents. Satan represents evil. So you're either pro or anti-evil, and you cannot be neutral. And that's why the article is wrong. It's wrong to present Satanism as just another idea. It isn't. And also, it's somewhat arbitrary in that they don't present any arguments for why it should be considered just another idea. They more or less force it on you. But he doesn't come out and explicitly say that it's wrong, come out and say that Satan is evil and that there is no neutrality when it comes to evil. You got to come down on one side or the other. You're either pro-Satan or you're anti-Satan, and that's the way it is. And that's what he should have done, but missed that opportunity, because a lot of times, again, conservatives think that that it goes with certain things go without saying. That's what we used to say. Well, that goes without saying. That goes without saying. These days, very little goes without saying. You've got to be explicit. You've got to come out and explicitly say what's wrong and why it's wrong. And again, this points up also is that if socialism is going to be defeated in this country, it's got to be you and I that do it. We have to be able to defeat the socialists in our midst. Not compromise with them, not create a counter movement to clash ideas with and come up with watered down socialist solutions, but really defeat them. And it can be done. Once you recognize that they're using psychological and psychologistic approaches, they're easy to defeat. But it's going to be up to you and I. We have to defeat those socialists in our midst that are family members, friends, and co-workers. And when we do that, we aren't going to see any articles in the Washington Post that are neutral on Satan. So at this point, that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.